Chapter 7, Lesson 3, A New Plan of Government, the Constitution's Sources. Although an American document, the Constitution has roots in other civilizations. The delegates who wrote the document studied the history of political thought in an effort to avoid the mistakes of the past. Many ideas found in the Constitution came from European political institutions and writers. The framers who shaped the document were familiar with the parliamentary system of Britain. Many had taken part in their colonial or state assemblies. They valued the individual rights guaranteed by the British judicial system. Although the Americans broke away from British rule, they respected many British traditions or cultural beliefs and practices. European influences. The English Magna Carta, 1215, placed limits on the power of the monarch. Parliament, England's lawmaking body, became a force that the king or queen had to depend on to pay for wars and the royal government. Like Parliament, colonial assemblies controlled their colonies' funds. The assemblies had some control over the colonial governors. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 was another model for Americans. In fact, many people in the United States felt the Constitution also needed a Bill of Rights. The framers believed in the ideas about the nature of people and government put forth by European writers of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement of the 1700s that promoted knowledge, reason, and science as a means of improving society. James Madison and other framers of the Constitution were familiar with the work of John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu, two philosophers of the Enlightenment. The English philosopher Locke wrote that all people have natural rights. He stated that these natural rights include the rights of life, liberty, and property. In his two treatises of civil government, 1690, he wrote that government is based on an agreement or contract between the people and the ruler. Americans interpreted natural rights to mean the rights of Britons defined in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. The framers viewed the Constitution as a contract between the American people and their government. A contract protected people's natural rights by limiting government power. The French writer Montesquieu declared in The Spirit of Laws, 1748, that the powers of government should be separated and balanced against each other. This separation would prevent any one person or group from gaining too much power. The framers of the Constitution carefully spelled out and divided the powers of the government. Federalism. The Constitution created a federal system of government that divided powers between the national or federal government and the states. In the Articles of Confederation, the states held most powers. Under the Constitution, the states gave up some powers to the federal government and kept others. Federalism, or sharing power between the federal and state governments, is one of the key features of the United States government. Under the Constitution, the federal government gained wide-ranging powers to tax, regulate trade, control the currency, raise an army, and declare war. It could also pass laws that were necessary and proper for carrying out its responsibilities. This power would allow Congress to make laws as needed to deal with new situations. The Constitution left some important powers to the states. The states kept the power to control trade inside their borders. They also could set up local governments and schools and establish marriage and divorce laws. The Constitution also called for the sharing of some powers between the federal and state governments. Both federal and state governments would have the power to tax and to establish criminal justice, for example. While the states had certain powers and shared others with the federal government, the Constitution and the laws of Congress were to be the supreme law of the land. No state could make laws or take actions that went against the Constitution. Federal courts would settle disputes between the federal government and the states based on the Constitution. Government structure. The framers of the Constitution used Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers. They divided the federal government into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The first three articles, or parts, of the Constitution describe each branch's powers and responsibilities. They detail the methods for electing or selecting key members of each branch. Government branches. Article 1 of the Constitution declares Congress to be the legislative branch, or lawmaking branch, of the government. Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The powers of Congress include establishing taxes, coining money, and regulating trade. Article 2 of the Constitution sets up the executive branch to carry out the nation's laws and policies. At the head of this branch are the President and Vice President. A special group called the Electoral College elects the President and Vice President. Voters in each state choose the electors who will make up the Electoral College. Article 3 deals with the judicial branch or court system. The nation's judicial power resides in one Supreme Court and any lower federal courts Congress creates. The Supreme Court and other federal courts hear cases involving the Constitution, federal laws, and disputes between states. Checks and balances. The Constitution contains a system of checks and balances. This means each branch of government has ways to check or limit the power of other branches. With this system, no single branch can gain too much power in the government. You will learn more about this system in the next chapter. Debate and adoption. Before the Constitution could go into effect, 9 states had to ratify or approve it. Americans debated the arguments for and against the Constitution in newspapers, at meetings, and in everyday conversations. Federalists and Anti-Federalists. People who supported the new Constitution were called Federalists. They took this name to stress that the Constitution would create a system of federalism, a government in which power is divided between the national government and the states. Among them were George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote a series of essays explaining and defending the Constitution. Called the Federalist Papers, these essays were later published in newspapers and sent to delegates at state conventions. They made a powerful argument in favor of ratification. Those who opposed the Constitution were called Anti-Federalists. They wrote their own essays, which later came to be known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. Anti-Federalists argued that a strong national government would take away liberties Americans had fought for in the American Revolution. They warned that the government would ignore the will of the states and favor the wealthy few over the common people. Anti-Federalists favored local government that was controlled more closely by the people. A Bill of Rights. The strongest criticism of the Constitution may have been that it lacked a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms. Several state conventions announced that they would not ratify it unless a Bill of Rights was included. George Mason expressed the problem. There is not a Declaration of Rights, and the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws and constitutions of the several states, the Declaration of Rights in the separate states are no security. From Objections to this Constitution of Government, September 1787. Ratifying the Constitution. On December 7, 1787, Delaware became the first state to approve the Constitution. By June 21, 1788, the 9th state, New Hampshire, ratified it. In theory, this made the Constitution law. However, without the support of the largest states, New York and Virginia, the new government could not succeed. In Virginia, Patrick Henry claimed the Constitution did not place enough limits on government power. Still, Virginia did not ratify the document after promises that there would be a Bill of Rights amendment, something added to a document. This promise was met in 1791. In July 1788, New York ratified the Constitution, followed by North Carolina in November 1789 and Rhode Island in May 1790.